The year 2021 marks the end of a 20 years long war against terrorism. As Western troops withdraw, they leave behind a bleeding Afghanistan, with a regime medieval in its nature and murderous in its acts. But looking back, we see that history is always grey. It is beyond the binary divisions of good and evil. And it is in this grey past that we find how the nations that take the moral high ground today are the very nations that once sponsored the foundations of international terrorism. Take a look at this picture. It is from the Afghanistan of 1970s. Obviously, this image is not representative of the entirety of that nation, but I'm not claiming that. What is interesting to see is that the lifestyle depicted in this image was a possibility in Afghanistan of 50 years ago. And the same lifestyle will lead to public executions in today's Afghanistan. While most nations have advanced and prospered in the past 50 years, it seems that Afghanistan has rolled back to the Middle Ages. The reason? Taliban, an Islamist militia that has withstood a war with the world's largest military alliance and still stands stronger than ever in control of the country of Afghanistan. It is notorious for harboring international terrorists and torturing civilians by violently enforcing its own interpretations of Sharia. Hello everyone, my name is Kushal, and in this video I'll be talking about the origins of Taliban and the role that the global superpowers have played in creating this international enemy. We'll begin with the year 1978. It was the year of the Saur Revolution, at the end of which a Marxist-Leninist party by the name of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan came to power. As soon as they came to power, the PDPA signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Communist affiliations of the Afghanistani party were very obvious from its very inception, but their ambitions were really misplaced. As soon as the PDPA came to power, it started pushing for some radical social changes. Although these changes were progressive in nature, they were in stark opposition to the traditional values of Afghanistan's tribal societies. Forceful implementation of socialist policies along with the enforcement of these social changes enraged the Afghan chieftains, causing scattered revolutions across the territory of Afghanistan. Fighters in these scattered revolutions against the communist regime of the PDPA came to be known as the Mujahideen. At that point of time in the late 1970s, nobody could have anticipated the impact that these scattered revolutions in a distant mountainous country were going to have on international politics for decades to come. Now let's talk about these revolutions in context of the international affairs of that period. When the Mujahideen started their resistance, the greatest superpowers of the world, namely the USA and the USSR, were engaged in a Cold War. In a display of their communist affiliations, the PDPA invited the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan and help them fight the Mujahideen resistance. But although the PDPA had sent an invitation to the Soviet Union, the Soviet invasion was also influenced by other strategic factors. Firstly, the USSR was aware of American proximity to both Iran and Pakistan, which are both the neighbors of Afghanistan. But more immediately, the USSR felt threatened from the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Islamic Revolution of 1979 that brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power. The USSR was afraid that this revolution might spread through Afghanistan into their own territory, destabilizing their Islamic provinces of Central Asian region. Considering these factors, the USSR entered Afghanistan in 1979, and the battle that ensued came to be known as the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979. Once the battle began, the USSR soon realized that they were not fighting against just ordinary people. The Mujahideen were supported not only by the United States of America, but Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as well. But let's discuss the United States first. Even before the Soviet-Afghan War had begun, the United States already knew about the communist affiliations of the ruling PDPA. They had already started secretly supporting the Mujahideen in their resistance against the communist regime. In an interview in 1998, former security advisor to President Carter explained that the US began aiding the tribal and Islamic uprising as early as July 3, 1979, which was 6 months before the Soviets entered Afghanistan. After the Soviet-Afghan War explicitly began, the Central Intelligence Agency of America expanded their covert support and called it Operation Cyclone, one of the largest covert operations in human history. The CIA employed its counterpart in Pakistan, the ISI, and through its help started pumping money and weapons into Afghanistan. Support from Saudi Arabia was utilized to set up madrasas in Pakistan. These madrasas became the institutions where the Mujahideen were trained and radicalized through indoctrination. Radicalization and extremism were the sole objectives of education. More shocking is the fact that the very United States of America that claims to be the beacon of idealistic approach to international relations was the one fueling radical propaganda. Back in the war zone, the Soviets were having a tough time. The war was taking a toll on the USSR. And one of the most significant reasons for this was the Stinger surface-to-air missiles provided by the Americans. These missiles were relatively cheap to manufacture and could be operated with ease by the untrained Mujahideen. Soon after receiving these, the Mujahideen were taking down helicopters and planes of the USSR every single day, making the war unfeasible for the Soviet Union. Years later, these same missiles would come back a full circle to haunt the Americans in their war in Afghanistan. Another major factor for Soviet defeat was geography. Afghanistan is a highly mountainous country. Around 75% of Afghan territory is mountains, and most of the remaining 25% is desert. This difficult terrain means that conducting a war in Afghanistan is a highly tedious job. Coupled with this fact of difficult geography was the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The border between these two countries is called the Durand Line. This line was demarcated by the British Empire, and like every other line that the British Empire drew, this boundary did not respect any realities on the ground. The Durand Line runs through the Pashtun people, who occupy the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan and the eastern regions of Afghanistan. Because of its mountainous terrain, this boundary has never been easy to administer. It is a highly porous border. What that means is that whenever the Pashtun people face a threat in Afghanistan, they can easily cross the border to Pakistan. What made things even worse was the fact that the Mujahideen were not a trained army. It was impossible to distinguish the fighters from civilians because most of the time the fighters were the civilians themselves. Another thing was that these fighters were very well aware of their territory. They started hiding in mountainous caves and valleys and started conducting a guerrilla warfare. They were soon out of the reach of Soviet tanks and planes. To counter this, the Soviets brought about a shift in their policy. Instead of picking individual targets, the Soviets started bombing entire villages, pushing people out of these distant villages into the cities where the Soviet military held control. But this indiscriminate murder of entire villages created a new issue. It led to a large refugee crisis. Women and children from these villages started fleeing to neighboring nations, largely to Pakistan. It would be impossible for any of us to imagine, but the life of a refugee child is not an easy one. Without food, shelter, and education, the only place where these refugee children could find meaning in their life was in Pakistani madrasas. Fueled with radical rhetoric of Saudi mullahs and armed with American-sponsored weapons, these refugee children were turned into fighters and would later go on to join the Taliban. The involvement of religious Saudi clerics gave this war the face of a jihad. American support and Saudi resources meant that the Pakistani ISI could now recruit fighters for this holy jihad from all across the world. One of the supervisors of this international recruitment drive was none other than the Osama bin Laden. He was introduced to the Pakistani ISI by Prince Turki of Saudi Arabia. As the leader of the international recruitment process, Osama bin Laden kept a roster of all of the fighters, their contact informations and their locations. It is believed that the Al-qaeda was a product of one such rosters. A combination of all of these factors led to Soviet defeat in 1989, and with the end of the war, the Soviet Union had made Muhammad Najibullah the new president of Afghanistan. But soon after came the fall of the USSR. Upon its foundation, the Russian Federation stopped sponsoring Najibullah's government, leading to its eventual fall. What the end of the war also meant was that the internationally recruited jihadist fighters had no reason left to stay in Afghanistan. Purposeless in Afghanistan, they started moving back to their own homelands. Radically indoctrinated in Pakistani madrasas and battle-hardened on Afghan soils, the return of these fighters started ruffling troubles in their own homelands. These ex-Mujahideen went on to become the keystones of other international terrorist organizations. ISIS is an example. Back in Afghanistan, even the largely Pashtun Mujahideen were left with no purpose. Without an enemy, they divided themselves into multiple factions, started battling each other for the control of power, and hence ensued the Afghan Civil War. On 25th April 1992, the Pakistani ISI had asked the largest faction, Hezb-e-Islami Gulbuddin, to form a coalition and start ruling Afghanistan. But the faction leaders chose not to adhere to ISI's request. This dishonor of their proposal led the ISI to support a surrogate force, and this surrogate force later became the Taliban. It started with Muhammad Omar and 3 other mullahs in the city of Kandahar. Tired of the instability after the civil war and the lack of Islamic virtues in the Mujahideen factions, these 4 mullahs gathered their students to form a force, and they called themselves the Taliban, the term Talib being Pashto for student. Remember those refugee children in Pakistani madrasas? They came back to Afghanistan and joined the Taliban forces. In the year 1994, the Taliban entered the capital city of Kabul, and they took control in the year 1996. By the year 2001, 90% of Afghan territory was under Taliban control. They massacred people who lived by Western values, took away all forms of contact with the rest of the world. TVs and radios were banned. Men were forced to wear beards, and women could not step out of their home. Justice was brought to the streets, and public stoning became the mode of its delivery. The Taliban had taken Afghanistan back to the Dark Ages. The covert operations that the CIA ran on American taxpayers' money came back a full circle in the year 2001. The entire world watched in horror as the largest military power in human history failed to defend itself against some radically charged fighters from a distant land. Coupled with the forces of the NATO, the Americans took the war to Afghanistan. The battle lasted for 20 long years, and after these years of warfare, Henry Kissinger's dictum once again stands vindicated. The Taliban is at its strongest, both militarily and politically. The case of the origins of Taliban speaks for the fact that radicalization and extremism always haunt the society in its entirety. It does not spare anyone. With this, I would like to end this video and thank you all for watching.